Hi, welcome to the RH Show, where I have wide-ranging conversations with fascinating people. We talk about all things psychology, mental health, and wellness. Today, I'm joined by a professor of education at the University of Derby. He's also the director of the Academics for Academic Freedom Group. Professor Dennis Hayes, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here, Professor Hayes, and we have a very rare Christian name, haven't we? But please tell us about your background, your trajectory in life, and how you ended up doing what you're doing.
Well, I started out as a classroom teacher and then a teacher of students with learning difficulties. And I've always been politically active in my trade union. I was the first ever joint president of the University and College Union. And I've always been very concerned about free speech being the essence of educational life, and so I've campaigned a lot about free speech. But I've had a fairly varied career. I went into teacher training and then into philosophy of education. So I sort of hover around different disciplines. I'm neither a sociologist or a philosopher, or certainly not a psychologist. So I'm a real educationalist in that sense. And education is a multidisciplinary field of knowledge. It's not a subject. So I came into higher education fairly late, after a wide experience of teaching, often in fairly poor parts of the UK, in around Essex and Tilbury and Basildon. I actually started out doing my first piece of research on Basildon Man in the late 1990s, and it was a very important subject at the time because Basildon was a bellwether constituency in the UK, and wherever Basildon voted, then that tended to indicate what government was going to be in power. And we wanted to find out what ordinary people actually thought. So we interviewed 500 people and did a lot of work on their background. And we found that they were very keen to improve themselves, and they were very very keen on having as much education as they possibly could, and they had a very positive attitude to life, and they tended to reject politicians. It was really studying in Basildon that made me think about something that was happening to our whole concept of what a human being is. So although it was a piece of empirical research, it made me think about a changed concept of human nature that was developing. And that became the focus of some of my later work when I became a university lecturer. I could tell you about that if it's appropriate now, or ask me a question about it.
Thank you for sharing to us your trajectory, Professor Hayes. Well, you said that you started your work in Basildon. I'm quite familiar with that place because I'm also in Essex. I live in Rainham in Essex, so it's not really miles away from Basildon. But as you've mentioned, you're an educationalist, so you've been in the field of higher education for decades. So what I'd like to hear from you, Professor Hayes, is how was it transformed? Well, at least when we speak about higher education in Britain.
I can give you an example. One thing that we do in the book, The Dangerous Rise of Therapeutic Education, which looks at all sectors of education to identify what we call a tendency towards a therapeutic rather than a knowledge-based course of education, is we give examples, because you can't establish what is in fact a sociological or cultural shift by just picking a piece of theory. You have to, or a policy that's been applied, you have to look at what's going on. And we spent a lot of time getting examples. And because I knew I was coming on, I thought of one that relates to mental health and higher education that really illustrates the therapeutic turn. And it was just a chance overhearing of a student leaving a tutorial at the university. And the student met her friend and she said, "Oh, that tutorial, that really affected my mental health." Now, normally when students been to a tutorial, they might say, oh, I've got to do more reading, or I've got to prepare better, and I'll learn to argue more. But the idea that, just going to a tutorial affects your mental health illustrates, to me, the therapeutic turn. And we saw over the years what happened in universities and all, in fact, in all sectors of education. It was a move to emphasize emotions over the intellect. A series of policies and practices that emphasize your emotional life over your intellectual life. And it's not so much about balancing emotion and intellect. It was about really emphasizing emotions. So we tracked, both in higher education and in wider sectors of education, the shift. So there was first a concern in the early noughties with self-esteem. And then it became a concern with self-reliance, then a concern with emotional intelligence, then a concern with well-being, then a concern with happiness, and most recently a concern with people's mental health. And what is happening in all these situations is we're looking at young people and students as if they can't cope. And universities have really adapted to this. So instead of having freshers weeks now, we tend to have welcome weeks and endless courses to help people cope with the stress of being at university and of exams. And I think it seems like it's a good and positive thing, but it's actually something that leads to a diminished idea of a human being. And on a self-critical note, when we wrote the book in 2008, it came out, and we were criticized a little bit for what we call the turn towards the therapeutic university, because people said, well, the university pursues knowledge, it's not going to become subject to a lot of therapeutic initiatives, it's quite different than other areas of education. And I don't think that was true, and we were proved right, because in 2016, the Collins Dictionary had as the word of the year, one of the words of the year or phrase of the year, the snowflake generation. And what had clearly happened, and we didn't predict this strongly enough, is that in all these sectors of education, from the nursery school to FE, young people and children were being taught to be more concerned about themselves than the wider world. And one of the teachers we interviewed, called Mark Taylor, a teacher in South London, he said, something's changed when children want to know more about themselves than the world. And this is clearly what had happened, that people became much more concerned with themselves and their own feelings. And of course, the aspect of that is of great concern to me in terms of defending free speech is that they then don't ever want to be offended or emotionally upset in any way. And that's what characterized, what people call the snowflake generation. And I think what universities did is they adapted to that. So the whole of the university as an institution, and not just in the UK, welcomed what we said as a diminished student. They were quite happy to see a student as needing a lot of help in terms of counselling and adapting their assessment techniques and all aspects of policy in the university to fit a student, because it's a very manipulative thing. Once you see students as vulnerable and in need of emotional help rather than intellectual help, then you can manipulate them. And I think to some extent that happened. And people like Frank Furedi wrote about the infantilization of higher education, that students were treated as if they couldn't cope. And that sort of benefited everybody, because lecturers didn't have to stretch students too much. And there's a sort of cozy consensus about this. The only good thing I could say that's happened recently, and there is a significant shift in the last 2 or 3 years, is that students themselves have become tired of being infantilized and treated as if they can't cope and they can't deal with ideas. I'm sure and your the people watch this program will know about all the examples of what students have tried to ban in universities, from sombreros and any sort of ethnic costumes to the statues of Rhodes in Oxford, and almost every day there's something new that students want to ban or find offensive. And that climate comes out of what we call the therapeutic culture, the therapeutic turn, the idea that you must never be offended. But the strange thing about it is there's some students have got so tired of this, they set up free speech societies. So free speech societies are springing up in various universities, and they're in Kent and in Sussex and in Bristol. The Open University last month set up a free speech society, and there's the free speech champions. So suddenly young people are saying, we've had enough of being treated like children. We can cope with debate, we can cope with arguments, and they're proving it by organizing debates, what they often call they're re-platforming the people who've been no platformed and people who found offensive. And that's a really exciting development. And meanwhile, on the other side, academics remain passive. I mean, the government in the UK are implementing a freedom of speech bill, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, because they recognise there's an intolerant attitude to speech on campuses. And we will soon have the situation that we'll have a free speech champion based in the Office for Students, and universities will be required to evidence their commitment to free speech. And students' unions will be brought within the law, so they cannot say that we're separate from the university, and so therefore we can prescribe people or ban people. They will have to also evidence their commitment to free speech. So it's a situation where, because academics, I think, have not really defended free speech, apart from a few notable exceptions, Kathleen Stock on the right to argue what she thinks is the case about gender identity, and there's a few, whether on the left or right, there's a few individuals who've made a battle for the right to have put forward the ideas that they have, whether people find them offensive or not, but they're few. And recently in Cambridge, there was a campaign to change. The university proposed that you had to be respectful of all views, and academics got together, and it took a long time for the people who were organising it to get them to be brave enough just to change the word respect to tolerance, because they said that they were too fearful. So something strange has happened in university academics. They've retreated into their own world. They've retreated into their subject. They've retreated into having quite a quiet life, and they self-censor. It's quite obvious that they don't say anything controversial, because as happened in the case of Kathleen Stock, where she was hounded by a small group of students on her campus and not really defended by other academics, and certainly not defended by her own or the lecturers union, the university and college union. So we have this very intolerant situation on campus, and I think it's something that will continue unless academics finally do something which is very simple. Speak up and just say what you think, and you have to take the consequences. I find it hard to believe that academics who are quite well paid and living quite comfortable lives are too frightened to speak. I think something else has happened, and that's why I emphasize the therapeutic turn, because one of the shifts that's happened, I thought I would always be safe defending free speech, because if you defend free speech, you never actually say anything controversial. You just defend free speech. But now defending free speech has become itself controversial, as people are saying there are some things you must not debate. You must not debate trans issues. You must not debate the climate. You must not debate a whole range of things, whatever people don't want to discuss. And that intolerance of debate, just would be inconceivable if it wasn't explained by the turn towards a more therapeutic atmosphere in universities. So that everybody wants to make sure that under no circumstances do they offend everyone else. So everybody is very nice to one another. So mostly at universities, everybody has a lovely time. They do the studying that's necessary, but nobody gets the intellectual challenge they used to have. That would be an exaggeration, of course. In some courses and some academics still challenge, but there is this what I call a cozy consensus that well, let's all get on together and not really do anything that may upset anybody by challenging their ideas. Most recently, Piers Ben has written a book on the changed state of culture. And at the end of his book, he argues for a return to the Socratic form of education. There's a lot more debate and questioning. So his book, which is called Intellectual Freedom and the Culture Wars, which I recommend, he suggested something that I have in the past suggested, return to a more Socratic approach to education, so much more challenging. I don't think it's a simple thing to do, and certainly if you promoted the Socratic elenchus, the constant questioning that leads to aporia, the sense of you're stung and you don't know what to think next, that makes you think to yourself, you'd almost be certainly be accused of bullying, if not worse, in an institution. So it's going to be a really challenging time for academics. I think the first thing I would say to anyone, if you don't believe there is a therapeutic turn, you just have to look around. And one thing, as I said, what we did was collect examples. And examples have a use. They can, of course, mislead, but if you get enough of them, and that's always, and you can see what's happening, something they're very telling. I mean, I was at the London School of Economics and I saw a poster on a wall that said, Overcoming Perfectionism. It was a course that was offered. And I can't remember the rubric exactly underneath, but it said, if you come to the London School of Economics, you might want to do really well. And perhaps if you're from abroad, go back to wherever you came from, and you might want to have an active role in politics. And then the message from this poster was, well, that might cause you distress. Therefore, you need to come on a course that will help you not want to be so perfect. And one of the top girls' schools quite recently had a similar course, which was called The Death of Little Miss Perfect, which tried to stop the girls in school wanting to achieve and be the best, because that caused them too much stress. And that this continual belief that people can't cope is underpinned by a very diminished view of human beings. And I think there's a lot of philosophy, sociology, psychology behind this. But the most telling piece of work is from 1966. I'm sure that many of your viewers will know this. It's Philip Reif's The Triumph of the Therapeutic. It's a very seminal and very interesting book, because he predicted what he called a shift from ascetic culture, from the culture where you struggled to achieve things for community ends, to therapeutic culture, where the need to have a sense of well-being became an end in itself. And that therapeutic turn is evidenced everywhere. And why it is dangerous is because it never ends. Because the need for therapy, the need to have your well-being reinforced, it leads you in a situation where you do nothing else. And the example, then, a parallel one, is to say, imagine if you just want to be happy, and say, why am I? And then you start asking yourself, why am I not happy? And we all know the sort of people who are like that. Why am I not happy? Then you just get more and more unhappy. And a similar case is people who say, why does nobody love me? And they're constantly obsessed with themselves. And once you become in that sort of almost narcissistic self-reflection, then you never achieve what will make you happy or anybody love you, because it's when you get involved in other activities that you become happy, that your well-being improves, and you sort of take you out of yourself in a sense, and then you can become happy. You often get involved in activities. You might meet somebody who you can then love and who might love you, but you cannot do it if you just focus on the particular feelings and the needs that you think you have as an individual. I think that situation is one that you can see coming up all the time. I mean, I mentioned that the move from being concerned with people's self-esteem. In the noughties, almost everybody was on television, on radio, and magazines were all writing about their low self-esteem, how anything that happened to them damaged their self-esteem. Now we have anything that happens to you damages your mental health. It's almost an unstoppable tide.
Mm-hmm. But would you say, Professor Hayes, because the way you describe the changes in the higher education sector is, in relation to academic freedom and in relation to focus and student experience, but would you say that the degrees start getting easier?
Well, and one of my other works, I've written about the McDonaldization of higher education, and it wasn't a good career move to write a book with that title. But I've recently gone back and looked at some of the arguments that were used in that book, and encouraged other people to write articles in another book called Beyond McDonaldization. And I think part of the McDonaldizing tendency is that things do get easier. I mean, if you have a situation, which happens in a lot of universities, where you break your courses up into modules, and then you set learning criteria and marking criteria for each essay. And I always give this example, students, from my own experience, will be asked to write a 3,000-word essay, and there will be 6 learning outcomes. The obvious thing to do is then write 500 words on each one of the learning outcomes for that essay. Of course, the essay then becomes intolerably dull, but it's a safe approach because lecturers mark to those criteria. So if you miss out one of those learning objectives, you get marked down. And you can see how that sort of lowers the standards, because the whole system is geared up to in the McDonaldizing way of getting more students through university and getting the qualification, the receipt for your fees, rather than challenge you intellectually. And it's not just in that form of assessment as well, it's in many others. Actually, the removal of assessment and the removal of examinations is another aspect. So I think, yes, it is true. And I think that is what explains grade inflation much more than, say, people marking too easily or just giving students higher grades. That may happen. But I think the whole of the higher education structure has become bureaucratized and McDonaldized in that way. So once you're doing that and teaching to learning objectives, then everything does become a lot easier. And that's part of the cozy consensus as well. It's slightly, and it's not separate from the therapeutic approach, because I used to be a teacher trainer, and I often wondered why there was so much hugging really going on in classrooms, because people talked about Carl Rogers's work, and there was a sort of almost a counselling approach into classes, a humanistic approach they called it, and everybody was using therapeutic languaging, wanting people to share their feelings and thanking one another and almost hugging at the end of classes, and yet what they were teaching was the most bureaucratic, competence-based program. It would be entirely broken up into learning objectives that had to be met and evidenced, and it was a very mechanical, bureaucratic course, and these courses still exist. They've been slightly changed, the standards have been revised and opened up a lot more, but if you're being teacher trained, you are being trained in that way. And the best way of doing that, of course, is to do it through a therapeutic approach, so it doesn't seem as rigid and bureaucratic as it actually is, because the process by which those learning outcomes are delivered is quite a nice one. Those classrooms are warm, everybody is very friendly, the tutors engages with the students, they all engage with one another. It's all a very pleasant environment, but that masks a ruthless objectives-driven curriculum. And you can see that working in lots of situations and in lots of different workplaces, because any managerial workplace adopts exactly the same thing. You'll be on a course discussing something which is basically do what your employer tells you about whatever it is. And what's the process by which this takes place? It's usually people sit in small groups on tables and with flip charts, going discussing something and feeding back to someone who's facilitating the session, and it all seems very open and very employee-centered or student-centered, but it isn't. It's very, very manipulative, and I don't think this is calculated. I'm just saying that employers have suddenly thought, oh yes, we'll adopt all these therapeutic techniques and we'll manipulate our staff. I mean, they believe they're necessary. They believe that's the way to approach things. And I think that is why it just happens. It's spontaneous, and it's very difficult to challenge it. You can draw it to people's attention. I mean, I was once asked at a student conference, how would you identify a bad teacher? And I thought, well, I'll answer that very simply. Anybody who uses a flip chart. That was my take. And about 300 students all laughed because they'd been flip chart to death during the course of that conference. Every session had a flip chart and a piece of sugar paper. And these things are just a pointless activity. I mean, I've been to hundreds of them and I've sat and discussed. It's quite pleasant, and then nothing happens. Somebody collates a series of sentences, and then nothing happens. So it's a pointless activity, but it's a feel-good activity, and you can continually find these activities going on. So, despite the fact universities got easier, what often happens in universities is time wasting. I wrote a short piece, I think it called 7 Ways of Skiving a long time ago, and identified what I called them skives, but they were actually cutting edge teaching techniques. One of which was, the small group situation. You can do that. Students coming through from school now are taught to sit in small groups and work by themselves. If any teacher who's tired can just say to them, "Oh, I want you to break up into groups and talk about a topic." I can give you an example of how that can be used very cleverly. I remember a newspaper article criticizing the introduction of therapy into universities. I think it was written by Frank Fried, I'm not sure. And students, and this is an example that somebody reported to me from their own college, the students had gone into class, their counselling class, with a copy of the article that was in, the Daily Express, and said, "Why are we doing this counselling course when this professor says that it's a load of rubbish?" And then what the tutor said to them was, "Well, that's very interesting. So why don't we break up into groups and discuss our emotional response or our response to what this professor is saying?" Of course, the class then went on. They did that because they were trained to do that. And the challenge was gone. It was never directly addressed, but it was taken aside. And one of the reasons I'm in favor of free speech and against these small group activities is because if you want to maintain standards in a university, you have to be able to make a public statement. You have to be able to say what you think to everybody and let everybody challenge it. People often mistake free speech. They think it's about having a platform and letting somebody, simply stand up and say what they think. But the important thing about free speech, it's about the audience. It's about letting the audience listen and judge for themselves what is being said, and quite rightly, if necessary, challenge what's being said. So the focus is on the audience, the people listening, rather than the speaker. And I think that's what's important. If you're not in the situation where you can speak and hear challenge, and you're sat in a small group with a few other people just discussing, you never have that public feeling of challenge and debate that should be there in universities. So often you see these situations. And one thing that was curiously that happened during the pandemic, from some examples, is that the pandemic, when people went online, and it brought about a situation where it was a return to a very traditional form of education. So the tutor had to stand up and talk to a class, or a class of screens. And so it became much more focused on content. I know some people tried to say you can have breakout rooms and everything, but the standard approach was lecturer, students listening. And so that was a return to something that people have spent many, many years trying to move away from. There was ever since a book published in the 1980s called "What's the Use of Lectures" by Ronald Blythe. I think lectures have almost disappeared from a lot of universities, but the pandemic brought them back. And it also brought back something that I think is really positive, because the University of Derby Students' Union and many others surveyed throughout the pandemic their students' views and what they wanted. And over 90% of them, week after week, lots of them responded was, we want to be back on campus. We want face-to-face teaching and interaction with academics, and I think, and with fellow students. And that has certainly been the case since we've been back on campus, not just at Derby, but everywhere, that students are really happy to be back, and because they're getting a real education again. But apart from the therapeutic aspects of it, which will still be there. So, but I do think that the real challenge is to make sure that people are not afraid to speak, because it's no good having any lecture if people are frightened to say anything and just sort of somehow make everything they say seem harmless and unchallenging. And I think that's the real danger. If we live in this world where no one's offended, and that all the challenging forms of classroom delivery or lecturing and of assessment have all been altered to make more people get through university in an easy way, then no one is getting what they really should have, which is a real intellectual challenge when they go to university.
But Professor Hayes, do you believe in absolute freedom of expression? What I mean is, let's say if a debate provokes violence or incites hatred in some way, so where is the boundary line?
I'm an absolutist when it comes to free speech. There are no boundaries to free speech, none whatsoever. I think that's always the lesson. And people will always say, what if people preach hate or violence? And I think the fact that you raised that question is a clue to what I've been arguing, that behind all this is a diminished view of human beings. They're seen as, in fact, as less than human. If I suddenly say, well, I want you to go out and attack somebody, right? Why would you as a human being do that? That human beings are intelligent and reflective. They can think, and they can think for themselves. So it doesn't matter what anyone says. People don't automatically go out and act, because they can think. They can say, what you're saying is nonsense. We shouldn't do this. And certainly if you've got any sense of morality, you wouldn't do it. So I do think it goes right back to the old chestnut of shouting fire in a crowded theatre. Free speech doesn't go that far. But if you just think about it for 2 seconds, that's not even an example about free speech. If I could press the fire alarm in a crowded theatre, and is that free speech? No, of course not. It's not speech in the appropriate sense. And even if you did, people wouldn't automatically react in the way that somebody with a diminished sense of human being actually has. So yes, I'm a free speech absolutist, because I believe that human beings, have intelligence enough to make rational decisions about whatever they're being told. Of course, we're told that they're not. We cannot bear to listen to anybody who is gender critical. We cannot bear to listen to anybody who's critical of somebody else's politics. So that is the sort of situation that has come out of the therapeutic culture. It's made it far worse than it was in the 1 or 2 examples about hate speech. The whole concept of hate speech itself is so subjective and vague that it's really impossible to make any sense of. But it can easily be used where somebody doesn't like what you say, they declare it to be hate speech. And I think that is a real attack on free speech. People are too worried to be called hateful. As you try to get me to say I'm in favor of violence, free speech that provokes violence. But you can only say that if you think that human beings are not up to listening and making rational and moral decisions for themselves.
I just want to bring this to the conversation, because Professor Hayes, it's been almost a year now after the beheading of the French educator Samuel Paty, and it's quite astonishing how educational institutions have been silent about this. So from an educationalist point of view, how do you think your sector can prevent crimes against educators from happening again?
Well, your example is a very good one. If they'd have spoken up about Samuel Beatty and again the Batley teacher who's in hiding still in fear of his life, then that would have made a start. But the silence was deafening in the UK. I mean, on the AFAF website, we tracked anybody who made any positive statements, and every day after day we checked whether the teaching unions or the University and College Union would make any statement, condemning the murder of someone for preaching for values of free speech. Only one union actually mentioned that somebody had been murdered, but they didn't say why or what the reasons were. So that total silence shows that the structures that are supposed to support teachers are just not there. And I think what we did was challenge them and ask them to make statements, and we made statements of our own, and several bodies did. The Free Speech Union, one or two other educational organisations made statements, but very few. And I think you just have to be brave and come out and say things. If you don't, if you're silent, the one thing that always happens when there has any sort of attack is the fear of being called Islamophobic. And very interesting, the use of the word phobic, the idea that we can't reason with you because you've got a phobia, you need help, you just need therapy. And I think that's the sort of the therapeutic culture still applies. And if you present, if you're Muslim, you're presented as a victim, and so anybody who makes any criticism, even of somebody who has murdered someone, then the challenge of being an Islamophobic is something that people are frightened of having made against them. But I do think it was a very low moment in the British educational system when trade unions and virtually no one, and not one university vice-chancellor said anything about Samuel Beatty. I think the contrast with what happened with George Floyd, everybody made statements, but not Samuel Beatty. And I think that's an issue that has to be debated. So we need to say more about why there's a silence about particularly Islamist killings.
I just want to touch upon what you said about AFAF, because we can see it from your backdrop that you're at the front of protecting academic freedom. But can you please talk more about the origin of your group?
Well, it started in early 2006. I've been writing articles in various newspapers, in the Times Higher. One had an appropriate title given our conversation, and here comes, they put the title on, "Here Comes the Touchy-Feely Brigade," about people who are going to silence speech through declaring it to be offensive. And Roy Harris, who's Emeritus Professor of General Linguistics at Oxford, had also written several articles. One that I'd recommend if you can find it. It's available on our website as well. Speaking Out for the Right to Speak Evil. And then he emailed me, and we met in Oxford, and he said, "Well, what are we going to do? We keep writing these articles." So we wrote a statement of academic freedom, which is the one that is on our website, which was a modification of the actual existing statement of academic freedom that exists in every university lecturer's contract, if they can find it. But we made some changes. We said that academics have freedom, and we removed within the law, which is in we're free speech absolutists, to question and test, receive wisdom, and put forward controversial and unpopular opinions without losing your jobs or any privileges you have. We also removed the word, put forward new opinions and ideas, because Roy made the point that old ideas are sometimes very good. So we thought we'd have a line in the sand for people to academics to sign up to, and for a year or two it had a lot of influence. Will you make a statement for free speech whether or not it's found to be offensive? And we then sort of moved into, as a consequence of this, into a lot of casework. So we deal with a lot of academics whose free speech is threatened for very often for very simple things. Somebody says something that someone doesn't like about a religion or about a course, or even just uses a metaphor. We have lots and lots of examples of people just expressing their feelings of dislike about something, or that lead them sometimes to charges of gross misconduct. And some of these cases are still active. As I won't mention them, but there can be very trivial issues that lead to people being suspended. But the twist in a lot of British universities, in fact, almost all of them, is that if you're subject to disciplinary proceedings because you've said something that no one likes, if you make it public, then it's a second disciplinary offence. So someone has been offended, you end up on a disciplinary. If you make it public, which is often the best way of defending yourself, then you can be subject to another disciplinary. So a lot of our time is spent defending individual academics, and I'm on the advisory board of the Free Speech Union as well, who do the same sort of casework and campaign, but beyond the university. So we restrict our activities, and have to, because of what we are. We're academics for academic freedom, to the university. And I can just give you an example of how long it takes. So somebody can be threatened with disciplinary action, then there's an investigation, and it can take 3 months, 4 months, 5 months before it comes to any sort of conclusion. And I do think it's taken a lot of our time over the years, and from the most eminent people. We have professors who come to us wanting help and advice, to undergraduate students who get into all sorts of difficulties just often for just saying what they think. So I think that's something that we're going to have to continue to do, but we're also expanding. One of the developments that will happen, in fact, in the next couple of weeks, is we've got a new advisory board made up of dozens of people representing all aspects of education, from undergraduate students to postgraduate students to lecturers to even retired university vice chancellors. So, and we have to move into being a bit more campaigning, just to get lecturers to actually speak up. So we're probably going to relaunch the Statement of Academic Freedom and ask people to sign up to it again. And I think it's more important now that they do that. And we have also challenged the new legal proposals by the government, because what we believe will happen is that, and it's based on our own experience, that instead of there being an open philosophical challenge to academics to speak up and defend free speech and win the argument for free speech, it will all go into legal casework, because the Director of Academic Freedom and Free Speech, the Office for Students, will be listening to complaints. So there'll be a big shift from arguing for academic freedom to going into legal procedures, which will often be subject to gagging clauses. So I think we're at a crux moment as far as universities and free speech are concerned. So I think, as I said, the great positive development is that students are starting to speak up. The students who are possibly the most vulnerable in many ways. Academics have got good jobs, they've got the backing of academic freedom clauses in their contracts, but students are speaking up, and that is a real positive development. So I think we're going to have to do a lot of work over the next couple of years to make sure that we keep defending the philosophy of free speech, free speech as the foundation of academic freedom.
Now, Professor Hayes, from academic freedom, let's move on to another aspect of higher education. I came across your work from an article in the Telegraph. It talks about citation justice. So just to give a bit of a context, citation justice is the measure that aims to tackle underrepresentation, to ensure that straight white men's based in the West do not dominate the field. So from an educator's point of view, and as an academic, how do you think citation justice will affect academia?
Well, it depends how you deal with how you respond to it. So if you think of, it's been recently said that the people who are least likely to go to universities are white working class students. And the history of what happens to often women or ethnic minority academics, there is no doubt that they were held back. Somebody was telling me that in the Russell Group University last week that when they were appointed, they were the only woman in the politics department, and certainly and the one who was expected to do more teaching than the academic men who did the research. I think that has changed. I mean, there has been movement, and there will be movement, but I'm against any sort of bias in assessment and citations. And I just think it's a sort of form of positive discrimination. So you have to be a little bit careful about doing what you think is the best for people. I mean, they're already people from ethnic minorities are overrepresented, given the percentage within the population in higher education, and it's increasingly the case that they are making an impact. And I think, but it would be wrong, I think, to do any sort of form of positive discrimination in any area. And I think it is just the case. You just have to fight for what you believe to be the case, no matter what your background is. I mean, we have slipped into a situation where people always talk about their past and their identity politics and their identity, rather than talking about subjects. So to me, if you really want to make things better for everybody, we need to reverse the therapeutic turn and not enhance it by being sort of kinder to certain people. I think part of the problem is we've moved away from offering the best sort of education. I mean, I'm always very impressed by Tony Sewell, who in Generating Genius has been fighting to get Black boys and girls into the best universities, by offering them to access to the best curriculum. And that is, if you want to change things, you have to offer the best sort of education. And I think that's the real challenge that we have, to get back to offering a good liberal education at university, liberal involving the sciences as well. So a real education, and not be involved in social mobility and social change, because effectively that has been the shift since New Labour were in power in the UK. Is education has become the place where everybody wants to solve every social problem, and that I think that is a real difficulty. And if you take how it can undermine things, it turns the university into a training institution. I mean, I was involved in the Research Excellence Framework, and it became mandatory for everybody to undertake unconscious bias training. It had come from the REF leading body right through to ordinary lecturers in universities. And I strongly challenged having to undertake that training, because it's a controversial topic, unconscious bias, and we should approach it through debate. And I managed to win the case that we had a debate about it. So we found out what it was and we debated it. And so you can have the tick for an institutional necessity of doing this, but do it through debate, because some of the training programs are very poor. And I've had many of them that just basically tell you what to think. And often you can't get beyond the first statement. If you want to disagree with it or qualify, if you're doing equalities training, do you think that multiculturalism is the best way forward in society? Not really. Wrong answer. So you can't get into a debate with a training program. And that is what you need to do in universities, to make sure that we have a really good academic curriculum in a traditional sense, and open debate and discussion and critical thinking within it, and not try and believe that we're setting out to solve the problems of the world. Because there's a real irony in a lot of this, is that when you have a really good education, then and that's a matter of logic, that you have a good education for its own sake, knowledge for its own sake, then the contingent consequences of that afterwards may be that you'll be more able to change the world, and your own world, and the world of a minority group or of a country, because you're really well educated. So I think all the emphasis should be not into amelioration in some unnecessary way, because it's unnecessary and it undermines education, that we should just try and offer the best education that's possible, to learn and propagate the best that has been known and thought in the world, to quote Matthew Arnold.
Mm-hmm. Now, Professor Hayes, it must be quite difficult for you to work within an environment which operates in cozy consensus, as you've described earlier. So how do you approach these challenges? Because I would imagine there would be a lot of criticisms and there would be a lot of, pushback with, what you stand for, especially in relation to academic freedom.
I don't think that's the case. I mean, it's perhaps slightly sadder than that. Is people just ignore you. I think you can just you can say things that are often the most challenging views, and people just say, "Oh yes, well, Dennis Hayes would say that." I remember somebody actually, I gave him the example about flip charts. The one that I used earlier, about just to say, I was doing a talk on what makes good educational research, and I was telling stories just to enliven the session, and it was to a staff development group. And the next session, the first person comes into the classroom, had a flip chart, and the class laughed, and they said, "Why are you laughing?" And they said, "Well, Dennis Hayes said in the last session, how do you spot a bad teacher? Anybody who has a flip chart." And the lecturer just said, "Oh yes, he would say that," and they just went on. So I think the difficulty is to think you're just being controversial for its own sake and not actually believing in what you say. But until recently, I think I've made good headway of being consistent. I'm not particularly challenging in a way that in an aggressive way, because it doesn't work. So if you're more reasonable but consistent about things, then people are persuaded, and you cannot just get it. I mean, you can't just stand up and say, "I believe in free speech," no ifs, no buts. I often do say as a sort of joke, if you hear somebody say, "I believe in free speech," you just wait for the but, because it always comes. "I believe in free speech, but not for this group, not for this person, not if it's offensive." And the thing that but does is it deletes the first part of the sentence. You don't believe in free speech. That's what the function of the but. And so I think if you're consistent and you give lots of examples, I think you can win people over. But one of the things about free speech is it's just not good enough to say things once. I go back to my time as working in special schools. I know that you have to repeat things and engage in discussion over a long period of time to win people over to any sort of position. I think that's true of not just free speech, but anything that's academic. And I think you can do that. You get enough support. The slightly annoying thing that I don't find it's oppositional, but you often, if I give a talk on free speech or McDonaldization or the therapeutic turn, often people will come to you afterwards and say, "I really agreed with what you said," because they didn't say anything in the session. Right? So the battle is to try and get people to actually speak up. But we've lost the sense of the public. We've lost the sense that it's important to say things in public and be challenged, and to challenge. And people will be happy to say to you something quietly, or they'll go home and say it to the dog or the cat and talk. But they don't feel the need to engage in any sort of debate. So, in that sense, arguing for free speech isn't something that leads to a lot of conflict. Even I did jokingly say that writing on the McDonaldization of higher education isn't a good career move, but people will often listen to what you say and just ignore it. And I think that's that is the change. If you say something that people dislike, instead of challenging it, they tend to just ignore it. And I think that's part of what is happening in academia when we talk about academics being passive, is that, you know, they just let everything go. And I think that is a very difficult situation. I mean, we just had a Battle of Ideas festival at Buxton. For the first time, the Battle of Ideas has come outside of London. You know, and we had some, you know, really interesting panels, and we say about at the same, it was at the same time as COP. We had two green speakers and two sort of critical speakers, you know, and a fantastic debate in the audience. But it's not typical in a university. You have to sort of engineer a debate where people can discuss, and yet, you know, do it in a respectful way. And by the way, that's not a qualification. I'm not saying free speech, but respectful, you know, because sometimes you have to be disrespectful. Sometimes you have to challenge it. You know, it's a matter of context. But it's, you know, I think that you have to now somehow consciously engage in whatever subject you're teaching. You've now got to consciously engage in a way that allows free speech and encourages free speech. By the way, I don't mean free expression. You know, students are quite happy to express themselves, and so are staff. You know, the idea you all go around just saying what you feel, and there's no criticism or any real debate. You know, that students are very happy about that. You know, I can give an example. One of our PhD students is looking at dyslexia, and she was in a debate with does dyslexia exist? It's quite a well-known academic debate, and the challenge was for her is that the three other panelists had all been diagnosed with dyslexia, and they just told their personal stories. So when they said that they did something that worked for them, she would then be quoting research to show that it doesn't work. They just ignored her and went on telling their story, and that they were used not to having any engagement, but just for free expression. So, you know, free speech and debate are not just about expressing yourself so you feel better about it. It's about challenge and being critical in that Socratic way that I defended before.
Mm-hmm. And Professor Hayes, on a less serious note, because we're about to end, what do you think you would be doing if you didn't become an educationalist?
I was going to ask these questions out, so like, these are throw it out. Yeah, I would. Well, at the time, I would be. I was a mountaineer when I first started. I wanted to do. I was obsessed by rock climbing, so I suppose I would have gone into being perhaps, I don't know, mountain guide. that was my, but not now. I think I'd be quite, you know, quite happy to do anything. I think I just. That was my ambition when I was in my 20s and 30s. So not to be a mountain guy, but that was my passion. that was there. So I think that's it. So rock climbing would have been my alternative.
Okay. And finally, Professor Hayes, the floor is all yours. Tell us what else is in the pipeline with AFAF, or do you have any upcoming book?
Yes, I'm just finishing a book called The Death of Academic Freedom, with a question mark, Free Speech and Censorship on Campus. I think that's, you know, I try to put into that all the arguments and experiences we've had. So it's really a handbook for academics or students who want to defend free speech. It's got some very interesting, I would say this, of course, chapters that give you the arguments to use. Because when I've discussed it with young people, they say, well, what arguments can we use? So we put some of those down. And the other book that I'm working on is a short one to update the dangerous rise of therapeutic education. It's called It's Teaching, Not Therapy. And I think, you know, just to bring things up to date. But of course, you know, I continue to be invited to speak at conferences. So I'm speaking in London on the 22nd of December on free speech for the Together campaign, the one that's campaigning against vaccine passports, but you know, campaigns on lots of other issues. But that you know, seems to be my role. And then shortly after that, I'm speaking at Sussex University on free speech. So my life is speaking about free speech in lots of different venues. And you know, the most enjoyable thing is doing that. You know, after the 18 months of the pandemic, to go and speak to students and academics and non-academics. Often non-academics are more interested in what you have to say than academics. So that's my future. 2 books and lots and lots of speaking.
Well, definitely, Professor Dennis says you're climbing the mountain of academic freedom, so to speak. It's been a pleasure having you here on the DRH show, but unfortunately, time is against us. I look forward to hearing more about your work.
Thank you for having me.